Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us for OIL's Arbaeen program. My name is s.a.w and I'm a member of the Organization for Islamic Learning. The Organization for Islamic Learning, or OIL, is a charitable non-profit community-based group that strives to build a membership whose main goal is to understand and practice the essence of Islam in an inclusive environment. We promote learning activities based on the teachings of the Quran and the values of its Prophet and his family. OIL is a registered charity, and as such, we depend on your donations to continue with our programs. Every little helps, and we can provide donation receipts for any amount above $25. We are accepting donations via our website, islamiclearning.org. Also note that membership is now due for those who wish to become members. Membership is $60 for members and $40 for students and seniors. We will be having a Q&A session after the lecture. Questions can be submitted through Menti. The code is 11640777. So that's 11640777. We would like to start the program with a recitation by Tassin Ali Daya, followed by a marshia by Nazneen Muhammad Taki.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We begin today following the commandments from the Holy Quran when Allah says, "Our salutations to the one who is the mercy for humanity, the Holy Prophet and his family, salawat." In recognition of Bibi Rubab, the mother of Ali Asghar, our salutations. In recognition of Bibi Zainab, the mother of Aun and Muhammad, our salutations. In recognition of Bibi Ramla, the mother of Qasim, our salutations. In recognition of Bibi Layla, the mother of Ali Akbar, our salutations. In recognition of Bibi al-Banin, the mother of Abbas, our salutations. Bibi Fidda, from Abyssinia to Arabia as a slave, freed by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam, who remained in service to Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. Our salutations to you. Our salutations to you all for the level of human degradations that you had to witness. That and the following days remain a lesson as to what it takes to be human. The call of Hal Minas Yansuruna remains the awakening call for all of humanity. O Bibi Khadija, our salutations to you for your investments. Having been blessed with the daughter, Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, O Sayyidatul Nisa Alameen, our salutations to you remain. O Bibi Zainab, our salutations to you in commemoration of your return to the plains of Kerbala. The trauma endured gives renewed strength to us all. When questioned, we hail your response, having witnessed the plight, nothing but beauty. Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. Our salutations to you, O Bibi. From Kerbala to Kufa, from Kufa to Damascus, and here you are, back on the land of tribulations, having fulfilled all what was asked by your brother, Abu Abdullah. Our salutations to you. O the noble Lord of Kerbala, O Abu Abdullah, you gave a new meaning to the sands that cradled the souls in Kerbala for self-worth. O the master of the martyrs, your legacy is a stimulant tide for change against force of tyranny and corruption. As we are reminded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it takes a level of conviction for one's belief system to be human. For that and more, here we are reminded yet again. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi ya ayyuhalladhina amanu Sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. Surely Allah and his subhanahu wa ta'ala and his angels bless the Prophet. O you who have come to believe, call for divine blessings on him and pay your tribute and acknowledge him as his message with due respect. Surah Azab. Salawat.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nazneen, and I thank the Organization of Islamic Learning to give me this opportunity to recite a mercy. Bar Shahanshah Madina, Imam Hassan Mujtaba Bawaz Buland Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Bar Shahanshah Kerbala, Husayn ibn Ali, Bawaz Buland Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. चहलुम के लिए भैया आई है तेरी ज़ैनब, ए मेरे भाई हुसैन, ए मेरे भाई हुसैन। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचाने। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचाने। जाऊंगी अब मदीना, जाऊंगी अब मदीना, चहलुम तेरा मना के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचा के। मालूम है तुमको ज़ैनब उजड़ चुकी है, लेकिन तेरी शहादत घर घर पहुँच गई है। शाबाश दो बहन को, शाबाश दो बहन को, भैया गले लगा के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचा के। भैया तुम्हारी ज़ैनब अब वो नहीं रही है। पहचान लोगे मुझको, हालत बदल गई है। चलती है ये ज़ईफ़ा, चलती है ये ज़ईफ़ा, भैया कमर झुका के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचा के। सज्जाद और बाकिर देंगे गवाही मेरी। क्या है ताज़ियाने बिनते अली ने फिर भी खाए हैं ताज़ियाने बिनते अली ने फिर भी। ले आ शामियों से, ले आई शामियों से, वारिस तेरे बचा के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना का दी बचा के। कैसे बताऊं भैया बाजार में जो गुजरी। कहते थे सबके मारो ये है अली की बेटी। बाबा के भी में बदले, बाबा के भी में बदले, सब आई हूँ चुका के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना खाली बचा के। उम्मत ने तुझे पे भाई रोने कहाँ दिया है। जी भर की मैंने तेरा मातम कहाँ किया है। रोएगी आज ज़ैनब रोएगी आज ज़ैनब फर्शे अज़ा बिछा के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना खाली बचा के। घर जाके क्या करूँगी पहलू में ही सुला लो। अकबर से कह दे मुझको तुरबत की जा दिला दो। मालिक हो तुम तो भी मालिक तुम हो भैया। जागीर करबला के भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना खाली बचा के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना खाली बचा के। जाऊंगी अब मदीना जाऊंगी अब मदीना चहलम तेरा मना के। भैया मैं आ गई हूँ नाना खाली बचा के। बर शहंशाह कायनात इमाम ज़माना बाबा से बुलंद सलवात अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मुहम्मद व आलि मुहम्मद व अज्जिल फरजहुम।
Thank you very much for those beautiful recitations. We are fortunate today to have Dr. Imranali Panjwani. Dr. Imranali Panjwani completed his Islamic seminary studies at Al-Mahdi Institute in Birmingham and postdoctoral research at Jamiat al-Mustafa Mashhad. He pursued law at the University of Sheffield, the University of Law, and Western Sydney University, and completed his PhD at King's College London. He is currently a senior lecturer in law at Anglia Ruskin University and head of diverse legal consulting, where he writes expert reports for asylum seekers. Can we welcome him with a salawat?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Salawat, please. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters, to the organization of OIL, to all the board members, trustees. It's an honor to give this lecture to you. Jazakallah for inviting me. And I pray to Allah that He accepts all of our efforts together, inshallah. First, my condolences to all of you on this event of Arbaeen. And of course, in the remembrance of the death of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, his family and his companions. As was advertised, this lecture, inshallah, 35 minutes or so, is to do with how we can compare the events of Kerbala and al-Husayn's life with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life. What are the parallels and contemporary relevance for us? And I say this because really just for a few reasons. One, as I shared with a few community members recently, I was in Jordan for 2 months or so, and I was doing research on refugees there. And I also was able to visit Palestine, actually. Obviously, very beautiful place, visiting Masjid al-Aqsa, the place of Mi'raj, and ultimately the place where numerous prophets have prayed, have walked, like Prophet Zakaria visiting Maryam, salamullahi alayha, and so many other maqamats that you will find there in and around Jerusalem. But of course, as you all know, the Israelis are occupying Palestinians. And I saw that firsthand because as Sister Sumaya gave an introduction, that, I do work with asylum seekers, and I write reports which get sent to the British court or immigration tribunal here for the courts to give a right to an asylum seeker to stay in the UK. So now when I went to Palestine, what I saw was horrific. The fact that Palestinians are occupied to the extent that they only get water pumped to their refugee camps twice a day, as opposed to the Israeli accommodation, which they get water 24/7. Doctors and midwives are not always allowed in refugee camps, even to help children and babies. And one of the reasons for that is the checkpoints, which where the Israeli soldiers harass, Palestinians, even when Palestinians want to move in their own country. And this requires another lecture. I'm not just trying to be political for the sake of it. It's linked to my lecture. That I'm giving this lecture because when I visited, Jordan, Palestine, sort of living there for a few months, when I visited the masajid there at the time of Ashura, because I was there for Muharram, al-Husayn alayhi salam's name was barely mentioned in the khutbah. I'm talking about Friday prayers, for example. There wasn't a commemoration as such for al-Husayn alayhi salam. Yes, he's acknowledged as the grandson of Rasulullah and this event happened, but there appears to be a disconnect, huge disconnect between al-Husayn's life, the event of Kerbala, his stand against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, his stand against injustice, and the stand of Rasulullah himself against Abu Sufyan, and the reform of justice that he was bringing in the Medinan and Meccan society. And that's why I began with my experience of visiting refugees and doing research in Jordan and Palestine, because the call of Hussein, we always say, is a universal call of justice. That's why I mentioned people who were oppressed, Palestinians who are oppressed, people who are oppressed around the world. But the issue which I found is twofold. One is, historically, the way we connect Hussein alayhi salam stand with the Prophet stand, and I say this for all Muslims, Shia and Sunni, that if this is a universal event, why isn't it remembered in such a universal way, in such an impactful way, in such a principled way, that it affects our consciousness, that today Muslim states should be united against any occupier, against any oppressor, that communities, Shia and Sunnis, should be more united against anyone oppressing them. But this is not the case. We know that there is infighting amongst Shias, we know there's infighting amongst Sunnis or between the two sects. We know that, generally speaking, and again, this is my research from reading hundreds of interviews of asylum seekers, that people who flee from Egypt, like members of Muslim Brotherhood as an example, or people who flee from Saudi Arabia or parts of Iraq, there is something common in all of their witness statements and interviews, which is either they're fleeing from an unjust government or a government that is Muslim but doesn't implement the Quranic principles of justice. Just now, today, I was writing a report actually about a woman that is fleeing from an honor killing in Iraq, right? Because she was forced into marriage and she has come to this country and she fears her own family who will kill her because she did not accept the forced marriage to an older man, actually. And many examples. I think a woman from Morocco who was assaulted, and I don't want to use certain words, it's public lecture, but horrific things happened to her. She's fleeing her own family as well, and has no confidence in the government because they don't always uphold the rights of women. Now, all of these things have one thing in common, which is that you're talking about Muslim countries, and there are issues in how we implement justice in those countries that people are fleeing them. That is not to say that the West is perfect. That is not to say we don't have human rights violations. Of course we do, no doubt. United Kingdom, you can see the books on my shelf. Maybe you can see one, maybe it's covered up by my printer, but there is a book I have just behind my printer, which is called International Human Rights Law by Dixon and McCorkadale. And there is a clear admission that before United Kingdom adopted the European Convention of Human Rights, it had the most dismal record, or the worst record of human rights before adopting the European Convention of Human Rights. So I'm making a very general point here, which is we have problems in the world of implementing justice, whether that's a Muslim state or a non-Muslim state. But the purpose of this lecture is exactly the title. What is it that al-Husayn alayhi salam exactly stood for against Yazid ibn Muawiyah that we can use today to reignite our consciousness, not just to remember this event that is deeply connected to Rasulullah's stand, which I feel a number of Muslims have forgotten that this is just a separate event, but two, how can our young people, how can us, my children, for example, use Hussein alayhi salam in a practical way in their lives? And I'll just pose you a question before I go into the nitty-gritty of the lecture. And this is a kind of discussion I have with my children as well, which I myself used to actually ask when I was a teenager, and especially in my early 20s. Let's put it this way. A young person today is surrounded by YouTube and social media, Facebook, everything. He's got so many, or she's got so many information at their fingertips. And they ask, at least this is my experience, is what I used to ask. Why should I attend Majlis? Why should I follow al-Husayn alayhi salam, as opposed to Gandhi, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, some other, Jordan Peterson, I don't know, whoever. Why can't I just follow them and follow their school of thought, right? That is not to say that any of these figures are doing anything negative or they didn't leave a negative legacy. They have left a positive legacy. But the fundamental question is, with all this information, and what I used to ask is, what is so specific about al-Husayn alayhi salam's stand that should reignite our consciousness, that should make us and our young people, our children, fall in love with Husayn alayhi salam, as I have done, and this is the reason why I'm giving this lecture. It's a love for the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, but what they specifically stood for. And I want to answer this question to you through the Quran in this lecture. Salawat, please. Obviously, I'm speaking in Zoom, so I'm not hearing salawat. So I'm going to wait 1-2 seconds, and then there's a salawat, hopefully, yes? Okay, so what's the first principle I want to begin with? Well, if you examine al-Husayn alayhi salam's words throughout his journey to Kerbala, you will see that he always, or most of the time, takes the Prophet's name and uses verses of the Quran whenever he is speaking to people along his journey, whether that's from Makkah and Medina, whether that is in Basra, as I'm going to give the example, whether that is in his letters to the people of Kufa, whether that is on in his first speech of Ashura, you will always see that al-Husayn alayhi salam is reminding people of his lineage, second, of the message the Prophet left, and verses of the Quran. Now we might say, oh, okay, that's normal. These are the Ahlul Bayt. But there's actually something deeper here. And let me just read a few lines out to you. In Maqtal al-Khwarizmi, which is a maqtal, one of the maqatil that we have, famous maqatil, which is actually written by a Sunni scholar, but it actually contains the fada'il of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, as well as the maqtal of Husayn alayhi salam. And a lot of Shia scholars use this book and have respected this book. It's a good piece of research. And in this maqtal, again used by a lot of Shia scholars, there is a letter by al-Husayn alayhi salam to the Akhmas of Basra, right? In fact, it says in the description, وَفِي مكة كتب الحسين عليه السلام نسخة واحدة إلى رؤوس الأخماس بالبصرة. This is the line before the actual letter. In Makkah, al-Husayn wrote one copy to the heads of the 5 tribes who govern the 5 divisions of Basra. The Akhmas is a special term for the 5 tribes who govern the divisions of Basra, right? So imagine at that time, al-Husayn al-Islam is not just speaking to one crowd, like we're having a majlis here. He's speaking to different tribes. This already should hearken our mind back to Rasulullah, because we all know that the one of the biggest challenges our beloved Prophet had was tribal disunity, speaking to different tribes fighting over small things, tribes fighting for their honor and killing people. I mentioned honor killing today. Yes, these things continue to occur. There are tribes in Iraq, there are tribes in other countries, and they do fight for honor. Of course, honor killing has got nothing to do with Islam, but it's a kind of manipulation of Islamic history. So this tribal honor was still existing in al-Husayn's time. So when he was giving the message, he was in a way facing very similar challenges to the society of Rasulullah. That's why this is the first historical connection. We should appreciate al-Husayn's stand even more because he's speaking to a divided society, a point I'll come back to. In this letter, al-Husayn says this. I'll read a few lines. أما بعد فإن الله اصطفى محمدا صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم من خلقه وأكرمه بنبوته واختاره لرسالته ثم قبضه إليه وقد نسح لعباده وبلغ ما أرسل به صلى الله عليه وآله وكنا أهله وأولياؤه وورثته وحق الناس بمقامه في الناس. Imam Hussain alayhi salam says to these tribes of Basra, he says, indeed, Allah chose Muhammad, blessings and peace be upon him and his family, from his creation and honored him with his prophethood and chose him for his message. Look at the second connection that exists, that he is reminding people that, look, remember who the prophet was? Allah chose him for his prophethood, or chose him to be his prophet, and chose him to communicate his message. And look at the link here. Al-Husayn is continuing that message. This is what, in my humble experience, as I said, traveling to Jordan, Palestine, other regions, this is where a number of Muslims have forgotten this deep, embedded connection. The message of Husayn was the same message of Rasulullah. And I will unravel this message. ثُمَّ قَبَضَهُ إِلَيْهِ. And this is a very important line. قَبَضَ يَقْبِضُ is a verb in Arabic, a fi'l, which means to snatch or take away something. Now, in this context, qabada is used to indicate death, that Allah suddenly, if you like, suddenly he snatched or took away the Prophet, which means Allah decided that the Prophet should return to him. That is, the Prophet passed away. And this also indicates that al-Husayn al-Islam was a realist, that he is telling the people that, look, the Prophet is not there anymore. So now remind yourself of the message, and also remember that you have me, that is Husayn alayhi salam. The Prophet is no longer, but I am here and I'm speaking to you. Look at the impact of this message that al-Husayn is trying to accomplish for the people. Because remember, Yazid ibn Muawiyah is in power. Now, how did Yazid come to power? Now, the simplest way is to say, oh, and we sometimes say this, I feel, oh, we can't do anything. Muawiyah broke the sulh, the pact with al-Hasan alayhi salam, and he appointed his son Yazid, even though he was corrupt. This was the history. Well, Muslims could have done something. They could have stood against Yazid. They could have helped Husayn alayhi salam. The Kufan people who were communicating with Husayn alayhi salam could have remained by his side instead of leaving him alone on the plains of Kerbala. So al-Husayn is trying to say that, look, the Prophet is no longer, but I am here. And then he says that the Prophet advised his servants, and whatever the Prophet was sent with, he expressed that. So he did his duty. The Prophet finished his duty. Now his tone changes and refers to himself as part of the Ahlul Bayt. He says that we are his family. وَكُنَّ أَهْلُهُ وَأَوْلِيَاءُهُ. We are his family. We are his associates. وَوَرَثَتُهُ. We are his heirs. And we have a greater right over the people for his position upon the people. So after the Prophet, who should lead the people? Who should lead the people? Who should be in the Prophet's position? It is his family, al-Husayn alayhi salam. But that is because of al-Husayn's righteousness. Later on in this letter, he says, we saw or enjoined upon what was happening in the society. But then al-Husayn says, we disliked division and loved public welfare. So these 2 points are very important. After introducing himself and connecting with the history of Rasulullah, which was my first point, the second point to answer the question as to what are the parallels of al-Husayn's society and the Prophet's society, and the second question I posed, why we or the young people should follow al-Husayn, he mentions 2 very important principles. We disliked division and loved public welfare. Now, again, I'm just giving my example because these examples often come back to me when I give majalis. For me, giving a majlis, is we learn from each other, is my expression of feelings for the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, and my journey to understand this message. That's why these memories come back to me. When I was 15, 16 years old, and I was listening to majalis from the Mimbar, when my dear parents used to take me to our small community center in Essex. Whenever our respected Maulanas used to speak, they used to give majalis for Husayn al-Islam. The constant words I remember when I was a teenager was al-Husayn stood for justice. He was against oppression. What Yazid did was corrupt. This was a terrible tragedy. Tragedy was often a word used, the tragedy of Kerbala, right? So for several years, I used to wonder, well, okay, fine, I understand that. But what did al-Husayn exactly stand for that I can use or fight for in my life when I'm going to school? Because I'm learning about different figures in school. I'm learning about Shakespeare. I'm learning about another figure. I gave the example of Malcolm X. So these are the figures more immediate to me, right? But al-Husayn, I saw as a person who, of course, who I respected, but I saw al-Husayn al-Islam as a figure in very general terms. And I still feel this is an issue today in masajid. I mean, you might have different experience, similar experience, I don't know. The way al-Husayn al-Islam was portrayed to me was this kind of saint who stood for these very general kind of terms, justice and peace. But what, the justice and peace have to be translated. This is too general. That's why if you were to read Nahj al-Balagha, letter 53 of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, it's a letter which is very specific about the way to run a just society. That's a letter that's more relevant. That's a letter that makes sense to me. So when I was reading that in my 20s, that made sense to me. I could now begin to understand the father of Husayn al-Islam, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, and why al-Husayn said to Muhammad ibn Hanafiya when he left Makkah, that he was saying to Muhammad Hanafiya that I'm not there for position, I'm not there for any political issue. I'm there to rectify the affairs of my grandfather and father. You remember that letter or that communication to Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. It says, I'm there to rectify the affairs of Muhammad, peace upon him, and Ali, peace upon him. So this is the connection that I was making in my younger days, right? It's the same question I'm posing to you. What were the principles of al-Husayn al-Islam? The first you can see from this letter was al-Husayn dislikes division. So he wants Muslim unity. As I began with, do we have Muslim unity? No. We don't have Muslim unity at the state level. That's why people are fleeing Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so many other Muslim countries and Bahrain, right? And two, we don't have Muslim unity at a community level either, right? Again, just to recount my experience of Jordan to you, that when I saw the refugee camps and the way they were living in dumps, when I saw how even we were harassed as well, when we went with our tour guides and them entering the vehicle, Israeli soldiers entering the vehicle, questioning us with a very big rifle, going to Masjid al-Aqsa and being stopped at checkpoints, etc. My first thought when I was there, but especially when I left Jordan, is that we privileged Muslims living in the West, or me living in the United Kingdom, you living in Toronto, us as privileged Muslims, it appears to me that there is so much infighting, whether it's between shuyukh or sheikhs, whether it's people sending WhatsApp messages and this Maulana, this sheikh or this alim said this, or splicing clips, or infighting between communities, that this person, this committee doesn't get on with this, or somebody has done this and it becomes a very big news in the community. This is the WhatsApp messages I was receiving, and maybe you receive these things as well. And even visiting centers, praying alongside each other, praying among Shia, for example, if somebody, for example, is more towards, I don't know, an Iranian style, for example, way of looking at Shia sort of theology, or somebody more towards Iraqi, or praying in a Sunni mosque, vice versa. These things at times seem to be common amongst our communities. And I was just thinking to myself, Palestinians are dying here. Palestinians are being oppressed. People are being killed. People are being denied medical aid. So what are we worried about over these very small issues? Okay, if somebody disagrees with this lecture, okay, no problem. We can have a discussion. There's a Q&A. And we respectfully agree to disagree. No problem. I'm here to learn from you. No problem. I have no issue with that. And sometimes we get so engrossed in the pettiness and minuteness that we forget that the real issues, the real call of Husayn al-Islam was, and I'll repeat, disliking division. There was tribal division in his time. There was tribal division in the Prophet's time. And there is division here now, today, in the 21st century, amongst communities. So what would al-Husayn's call be? It is to unite amongst the principles we agree with, and not to fight over the petty issues that seem to plague our communities, lest we become exploited, which is how Yazid exploited the society, through division. He exploited the society knowing that people would not be courageous enough to stand against to stand with al-Husayn al-Islam. That's why, if you notice in the journey of Kerbala, at every point, Yazid was getting angry. Yazid was trying to exact his vengeance because he saw that al-Husayn did not give allegiance to him. So that irked him. So every time, if you notice in the journey of Kerbala, some people were advising al-Husayn Islam that, just give allegiance. You can still preach and still preach religion, but just give allegiance to Yazid ibn Muawiyah. People often say this, to me, to other people, don't say this, don't say that. But what's the point? We have to be principled to protect the principles of justice, because otherwise, what's the point of the Islamic message? The second principle that he stood for was public welfare. This is exactly in his letter. I'm quoting it to you. Public welfare. So he wanted to make sure that the orphans and the poor people were being looked after. And that's absolutely wonderful, because that is the legacy of Rasulullah. His wife Khadija, salamullahi alayha, was known for looking after orphans. Prophet adopted a son, Zayd, and freed slaves, and always made sure that the poor people were looked after in the masajid or outside of the masajid. That's why you have the system of sadaqah, the system of zakat especially came about. So you can see that the whole message of Rasulullah was economic and social upliftment. So that should be the second goal, that after unity, we are there to uplift society. That's our goal. So al-Husayn saw a society that was far removed from Rasulullah's society and the Sunnah of Rasulullah, and these were the first intricate principles of his stand. Salawat, please. The third principle, and I'll just read out this, I think 5-6 minutes, and I'll do the maqtal, inshallah. Another remark of al-Husayn alayhi salam is from Tariq al-Tabari, volume 6, page 229. He says, "O people, indeed the Prophet of Allah," look again, taking the Prophet's name, "the Prophet of Allah, may Allah bless him and his progeny, said, anybody who sees a tyrant ruler who treats the haram prescribed by Allah as halal, infringes his covenant in defiance to the Sunnah of the Prophet of Allah, and treats the servants of Allah by means of committing sins and enmity, and they do not revolt against him in words or deeds, Allah has every right to drive them to their abode, that is hell." I mean, this is powerful. At least to me, it's very powerful. Apart from taking the Prophet's name, we have the third principle al-Husayn is leaving us with, which is respect for the specific moral principles of the Prophet's Sunnah, and fourth, the courage to stand up against anyone that is infringing or corrupting the morality of the Quran and the morality of Rasulullah. So again, going back to this question, which I used to pose myself, and maybe young people pose with, is that why should we follow al-Husayn alayhi salam? Okay, well, one major answer is his courage to stand alone in the desert, despite the Kufan people abandoning him, to stand alone in the desert, knowing that he's going to be killed, but standing up for the principle of morality, thinking long-term that his stand would be remembered by others, or may be remembered by others. Al-Husayn cannot predict the future, but believes in his principle, that his stand as a righteous person will remind others to stand against tyrant rulers. Now, if you look at other revolutionaries, I mean, let's take Martin Luther King. Okay, what he did for the Black civil rights movement was wonderful. I remember studying this in school. We did American civil rights history, wonderful episode, interesting episode in civil rights history. But if you look at his private life, I mean, he also was not particularly moral. I mean, there are reports of him doing immoral things. Now, that's fine. I mean, look, may Allah bless, elevate the station of Martin Luther King, forgive his sins, forgive all of our sins. But al-Husayn alayhi salam, in his private life, didn't do anything immoral. What he said he practiced. He is a role model because in his private life, he still stood by those principles. And in his public life, he carried out those principles, right? Other revolutionaries, whatever the legacy, may not have always done that. And two is that al-Husayn alayhi salam himself was an inspirational figure that left a legacy for others to follow, that today we are still remembering him. So you can even measure, if you want, I don't know, in quantum terms or in mathematical terms, if you want to measure the impact also of legacy, this is also, his impact is measurable, right? You can see people going still ziyarat, you can still see Shias remembering this, you can still see his ahadith, his words recorded in history. It's a measurable impact in that sense. And the third thing is, you also see the emotions of al-Husayn alayhi salam. Personally, for me, this is also very important. I'm conducting research on the early life of Rasulullah in terms of the early surah or chapters of the Quran and how the revelation affected the emotions of Rasulullah. The burden of revelation on Rasulullah's shoulders, how he developed his patience. These are questions I always feel are not answered. So that was your message. No. So here you see the emotion of al-Husayn coming out. I mean, how would you describe the tone of al-Husayn in this message that I have read out to you when he says, and if people don't revolt against him in words or deeds, Allah has every right to drive them to the abode of hell. Is it a tone of anger? Is it a tone of distress? Is it a tone of grievance? Is it a tone of kind of being tired and, if you like, fed up with the fact that people are not responding? I would humbly say it's all of these things. These are the emotions of al-Husayn alayhi salam. He wants people to stand up. He's tired that people are not responding. He's expressing his emotions here. We often don't discuss the emotions of Prophet and Imams because sometimes we might feel, oh, we are humanizing them, even though they are human beings, and we might feel they are, we are lowering the status. No, I think this is the greatness of their status, that they had to endure these struggles. They had to be patient. They had to express this boldness in their tone. That's the only way they could communicate the message of Islam and the message of Rasulullah to the people. That makes us closer to them. So when we are delivering a speech, when we are undergoing struggle, it is our right to express a kind of tone. It is our right to express a kind of, if we feel disgusted with something and something has not happened, we should express this with passion. Why not? So we have to learn even from these literary tones of the Prophet and Imams. So you can also see here as a final principle, which is the passion of al-Husayn alayhi salam. We should feel passionate about standing for justice as Rasulullah did. Salawat, please. I will end in a few minutes and give the maktal. I think I've taken 35 minutes. I think I had about 40 minutes. One final example I want to give is from a verse of the Quran. And inshallah, maybe we can continue this another time, whether through tafsir or another series of lectures, no problem. At the time of the Prophet, this is the third point I want to mention because I've talked about the historical connection of Rasulullah to Hussein, the mentioning of the name of Rasulullah to the principles of Rasulullah, and three, the characters in history. At the time of Rasulullah, there was a figure known as Walid ibn Mughira al-Makhzumi. Walid ibn Mughira was the tribe of the Makhzum clan. And he used to harass Rasulullah verbally and physically. And you will find his qissa, or you'll find this in our historical books, but the books that I have consulted are Majm al-Bayan by Allama Tabrisi and Tafsir al-Safi, and several other Shia and Sunni tafasir. And in Majmal Bayan, you will see that the sababun nuzul, or the reason of revelation for the following ayah, which I'm going to recite, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Dharani wa man khalaqtu wahida, which is Surah Al-Mudaththir, verse 11, Allah says, leave me and him whom I created alone, refers to Allah creating Walid ibn Mughira and dealing with Walid ibn Mughira. Why? Walid ibn Mughira was one of the people that conspired against Rasulullah to try to call him Majnoon, crazy, or Kahin, that he was a soothsayer or fortune teller. 3, that he was a sha'ir, a poet. Why? To diminish the words of Rasulullah as if the revelation of the Quran was something not very important. He was trying to lower and diminish the impact of the words and the ayat of the Quran to the people. That's why you find verses in the Quran talking about the struggles of Rasulullah, whereby he had to face these accusations that he was crazy, that he was a fortune teller, that he was a poet, and that the verses of the Quran were nothing more than something made up from witchcraft or from poetry, right? And Walid ibn Mughira was a powerful tribal leader. He had a lot of wealth, he had 7 children and a lot of position. But look at this verse of the Quran. The Prophet is feeling sad. The Prophet is feeling distressed. The Prophet wants to react to Walid ibn Mughira. See, these are the natural emotions that we may not always discuss when discussing Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, but this is the sababun nuzul I'm giving you from the tafsir. So Allah reveals this verse and says to the Prophet, leave me and him whom I created alone. What's Allah saying here? Allah is saying, oh Prophet, I know you are feeling distressed. I know you're feeling this grief inside. I know you want to react, but leave me to deal with this Walid ibn Mughira. And in fact, in the tafsir, the word intiqam is used, which is revenge. Allah is going to exact his revenge or retribution towards Walid ibn Mughira. And what happened at the end of his life, Walid ibn Mughira lost his wealth, lost his position, and 3 of his children submitted to Islam, something he didn't expect. What does this show? And I will end here. What this shows is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a system of justice, and he will exact his justice in this world and especially in the akhirah. But it shows that for us to usher in this system of justice, we have to exercise our free will and be courageous, as the Prophet was, to continue on with his message. Leave me and him, yes, Prophet had to be patient in that instant, but he still continued on the message. He didn't stop. He didn't say, right, Allah is going to deal with this. Yes, Allah dealt with that particular figure, and Allah has a system of justice that requires a series of lectures. But Allah told the Prophet to continue his stand, to continue on with his message, and the revelation continued until he was able to return to Makkah and claim victory. These are the beautiful and resounding parallels of al-Husayn's life with his beautiful grandfather's life, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. My dear brothers and sisters, this is the event of Arbaeen, which we commemorate, which we remember. It is an event of remembrance of Hussein, his family and companions. But I ask you, how should we remember them? How do we put into words the sacrifice they underwent, the struggles they underwent? The words I can say to you, which, to be honest, to me, are so graphic that there are no better words to describe this. But these words which I will say to you are the words in Ziyaratun Nahiya, whereby the Imam says the following in remembering the tragedy of al-Husayn alayhi salam. He says, As-salamu ala dima'is sa'ilat peace be upon you. Oh, the flowing blood. When we give our salams to Hussein alayhi salam, we take the name of Hussein, or we might take the name of Abbas alayhi salam, we might take the name of the family or ashab, but he takes the name of each body part of Hussein and his family, the blood of Hussein. As-salamu ala dima'i sa'ilat. Then he says, As-salamu ala a'adha'il muqatta'at. Peace be upon the dismembered or the cut off limbs from the bodies of the martyrs. Now he's giving salams to the bodily parts of the shuhada. We know that Hussein's head was cut off. We know that Abbas's limbs were severed. So he's now giving salams to their limbs. Then he says, As-salamu ala ru'usil mushalat. Peace be upon all the elevated or raised heads, because Hussein's head was raised when it was cut off and then transported to Kufa and Sham. So now he's giving salams to the head of Hussein and all those people whose heads were cut off. As-salamu ala niswatil barizat. He now gives peace to the exposed women, the women who are in chains, whose veils or whose clothes were not appropriate for them and were taken from them, that they were not left in a respected manner. So when we remember Hussein alayhi salam, it's not just Hussein, it's his limbs, it's his blood, it's his head, it is Abbas's limbs and head and blood. Our 8th Imam alayhi salam says, Ya ibn Shabib, in kunta baqiyan li shay'in fa'abki lil Husayn, فَإِنَّهُ ذُبِحَ كَمَا يُذْبَحُ الْكَبْشِ. Says, oh Ibn Shabib, if you want to cry for anything, then cry for Hussein. Indeed, he was slaughtered like a sheep is slaughtered. A sheep is an innocent animal who does no harm to other creatures, whose wool is white and pure and innocent. So Hussein was that innocent sheep who did no harm to anyone, whose wool, whose skin was covered in blood, whose beard was covered in blood. My brothers and sisters, this was the massacre of Hussein alayhi salam. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Rabbana la taj'alna ma'a qawmi dhalimin. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask you to please do not make us like the unjust people. Oh Allah, please give us strength to help all the oppressed people around the world. May you give your shafa to the ill people around the world. May we help them. Oh Allah, please help us learn from the character of Hussein alayhi salam, his family, that we may improve our deeds, inshallah. And oh Allah, may you hasten the reappearance of our dear 12th Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Mahdi, Ajal wa Faraja. Surah al-Fatiha, please.
Thank you for that insightful talk. We'll now continue with Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, then please go to menti.com. The code is 11640777. We have a few questions in. Should we prioritize unity and avoid arguing over petty issues with other communities or with people who are not aligned with us politically as much as within our own Muslim communities?
Jazakallah Sumaya. So if I understand the question correctly is, so should we unite on sort of basic principles and ignore petty infighting? Yes, that's the first. And the second part is, could you repeat the second part?
or with people who are not aligned with us politically as much as within our, so it's within our own Muslim communities or outside within the larger community within
Right,
other.
right. Sure. I don't see any reason why we can't do both at the same time. Number one, I mean, you can have good relationships with fellow Sunni brothers, with other Muslims, with other sects, with other religions, and at the same time, sort of be part of your community, but also not associate with those who may be doing corruption or injustice or making a stand with that. And I see where it's coming from. I guess is maybe trying to say that, fine, we might unite generally and ignore sort of petty debates, petty theological debates, but at the same time within our community there might be a problem, and we have to make a stand, and it can cause disunity, and sort of politically align ourselves with people more on the outside because their principles are more similar. I would humbly say we can do both. Two is that it's a process and it's not something done instantaneously overnight. So obviously some people will react, some people will accept things or not. And for example, having lots of dialogue, let's say with our fellow Sunni brothers and agreeing on certain things, maybe some Orthodox Shias may not like it, that, okay, we are coming to terms or, with certain sects and all that, but I don't see why not. Even our respected Maraja also say that not to curse, for example, the companions of Rasulullah. So I think that we have to go back to the Quran, and where those principles we all agree on, there shouldn't be any infighting with it, and the pettiness should be left. So those within our communities, let's say Shia community, that say, why you are consorting, let's say with a fellow Sunni brother or Jewish brother or Christian brother, for whatever reason, I think that requires education and reform, which can only be done, as I said, as a process. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but that's my answer: to do it simultaneously and work through an educational process, inshallah.
So sort of related, there is another question saying there are issues of differences within our community for sure, but what is the solution? I don't hear the message of unity on the minbar as much nowadays as I did when I was younger either. Okay,
Jazakallah. Bigger question. Unity is something that we all have to work towards for, and it starts everywhere, but let's say with leaders, okay, whether it's Maraja, whether it's scholars, whether it's politicians, community leaders. I think at that level, if there are issues of disunity, then that is their responsibility, and we all have to take account for that. So if Shia and Sunni scholars, let's say, are not having as much dialogue, I mean, I'm not a leader that I can say, yeah, now I have to do that, but we should hold our leaders to account. Okay, why aren't you having dialogue? I'm just giving an example, okay? Or if there are ways that we can be more united in let's say praying together, Salatul Eid, or more united as Shias and Sunnis praying together, that is the responsibility of leaders, and we have to hold that to account, because there's nothing that stops us in our fiqh fundamentally from doing that. I understand there could be different procedures and conditions and shurut amongst different maraja or whatever it is, but I think that's something that we have to make noise about. In terms of communities, sometimes working from bottom up is better, which is if we can set good examples as much as we can in having dialogue, in praying together. For example, as I said, when I was in Jordan, Shia Sunnis praying together, no issue. People knew I was Shia, it was no issue, and we prayed together. And even at an individual level, even if we might not feel I'm making impact, it is an impact, because when people find out, okay, I'll just give a very simple example, just on an individual level. I was praying with my fellow Sunni brothers, I had no issue, right? And praying at their times, whatever. And people then find out I was Shia, no problem. People used to ask me questions. Oh, is it true, Imran, that you do curse the companions? Is it true that, for example, you do Zanjir? And is this religious, etc.? All these things. And I was giving very honest answers. Look, this is done by a minority of Shia. There isn't at times religious basis for it. Our respected scholars have X, Y, and Z. So they got a better understanding, really, of what is love for Ahlul Bayt, and maybe what, unfortunately, whether there are extremities that we do have at times in our community. So even that you can see was a process of education which had a big impact in the institute where I was. So I think that is a way that we have to do things from bottom up and to hold people accountable that are not doing these things, inshallah.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. Thank you much for your insight again. The organization would also like to extend our thanks to the individuals involved in the program. As stated on the on-site, membership is now due and payment can be made through our website, islamiclearning.org. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us through our email, info@islamiclearning.org. I would also like to remind all of you watching that you will be able to listen to all previous lectures on our YouTube channel, and please consider subscribing to be notified of all lectures and programs that we have. As usual, we would like to now end with the Surah Fatiha for those who are no longer with us. Al-Fatiha.